things that you hang on your belt. All right, so the first official question for the AMA is, what is the best fabric for amped guard belt gear? Specifically, the things that hang from the belt. I would argue that a good quality or even medium quality broadcloth. So broadcloth is a type of weave, or the fabric itself, not like a brand or anything. My favorite brand of broadcloth is Kona. However, I have literally used bed sheets and quilting cotton from Joann's. So the only way that something from the belt is going to get torn is if you overstuff it. If you have it like the opening itself is like open and somebody's weapon somehow like gets right into it and yanks it. But yeah, so Kona cotton. So Kona is the brand, cotton's the material, broadcloth is the actual fabric. Yeah, I love it. I love it for everything except for actual garb, because it doesn't breathe well. So, but honestly, a lot of the things that I've made have been using quilting cotton. So, because I love the prints. Like this is just quilting cotton. It's actually may not be marketed as quilting cotton. It's a spoon flower, I believe. It's their signature cotton, so probably a basic quilting cotton. So to summarize that, because I kind of went a little long on the very quick explanation, just about anything. Your chances of ripping a belt favor really comes down to catching it against something sharp or abrasive or overstuffing a belt pocket. Those are going to be your most likely scenarios that would lead to a tear. And the overstuffing just because it makes it easier for someone's weapon to catch it and like catch it and the force being hung up on whatever's in the pocket itself. So quilting cotton, a broadcloth, a bed sheet, I mean pretty much anything, as long as it's not a super thin fabric like a sheer, something that, something that's just accessories. If you'd make a pillowcase out of it, it's probably safe for a belt favor. Standard belt size to be safe for fitting for. The belt itself will vary, however, it's the belt ring that you want to size for, because a lot of people will put things from both ends of the belt, and most belts are about 2 inches wide, but the belt ring itself can be about 3 inches. I tend to make my belt pockets and belt favors, they are 3 3/4 inch, that belt area. So from the top of the belt loop to where it's sewn, there's 3 3/4, so 3.75 inches. Yeah, so the material for applique is going to vary, but for the belt pocket itself, if you're just making a simple belt pocket out of something, you're not appliquing or embroidering on it, then just about anything. What typical things do people like to have as belt favors? Thinking for making things to sell or gift, do you have examples? I do have examples. It will require me to get up. which I don't mind. So heraldries are a good one. People love having their personal heraldries on things. Park heraldries. Fun, random things. But it's the most common things you will see on a belt favor is going to be personal heraldry, park heraldry, company or household heraldry, or just something goofy like nerd things and stuff like that, or some, might put a skull on it, or something to make it just a little bit extra versus or setting it apart from other stuff. So we'll get up, move my table and rotate, and I shall grab something to show you. Alright, so examples of quilting cotton. I'll actually just switch scenes here because I have a lovely table set up. So this is just a basic belt pocket that I've got. This is my favorite one. I wear it all the time because it's rainbows. But it's just Joann fabrics. It's just basic Joann fabric. I used 3 different kinds. You can't really see the swirls. It's a white on white, so it's a little hard to show up on camera. But that is a standard belt pocket. So my park heraldry is another one. Yes, this is a little... I have an unfair advantage because I have an embroidery machine. But so that is a heraldry for a park for Satyr's Hollow. Then there's this one, and it's just a Griffin patch that was bought off of Etsy. It was given to me by a player named Griffin. And then this would be like a commemorative for an event one. So we had an event called the Battle of the Bones at Satyr's Hollow. It was our very first KLE. And I whipped up a bunch of them to help raise funds for the holding. So, so just as an example. So this one was given out. Griffin wanted to give his favorite people a belt favor. And so we got some Griffin patches off of Etsy, and we were able to do that. And then I wanted to make belt favors to commemorate all of the founding members at Satyr's Hollow, so that's what the gold is. So, but yeah, so that's an example of belt favors. So yes, those are some examples. Tell me a story of the goat on yours, and how do you attach it? So the Garrett, this guy. So this is Garrett. It's my kid. He is my travel companion. I have several goats. In fact, they're strewn all over the bedroom. But so well done with that transition. Thank you. I made harnesses for all of my goats that I trust to take out. And it, just I didn't give myself enough belt room to clear the ring, but it's some elastic right here, and just a loop. So if we turn it this way, it's just a loop for the belts, a loop for the goat, and elastic in the front. Mostly because I didn't have enough fabric to go around the front of the goat, and it makes it easier to slip it on and off. Because I go over the head, pull it down. And it's a little harder to get the legs in, but it was just a little. I wanted to be able to take them with me, and I love things on my belt, so I made the little harness for them. So the story of the goat itself, I don't really have one. So I've just been collecting goats because I am the satyr, and I myself am sometimes seen in a goat costume that I was very well known for wearing back at my original park, which was when I started Amped Guard 12 years ago. I was from the... was it a Dutch? No, it was a barony of Skystone in Billings, Montana. So that was the Kingdom of Desert Winds, which is a very big kingdom. And I mean, day one I had a satyr costume, and then I just continued to make various satyr costumes. But when I came here, I didn't really have my satyr costume, so it was many years of not having a satyr costume, but I eventually did, and I actually showed you the picture of the costume that I had. And only recently, I think in the last year or two, I started taking my travel kids with me, and it's mostly for the puns, Yeah, this is Garrett. He's my kid. Have you read Life in the Goat Lane? No, I have not, but I was reading The Adventures of Billy the Goat. I was reading that at one point. Yeah. Speaking of your satyr costume, that reminds me of pants. What kinds of fabric do you use for sturdy pants to breathe but not tear for super active fighters? So there are two things in my almost 20 years history that are just the bane of my existence, and that is sleeves and pants. I would say broadcloth. Again, broadcloth is a very general purpose fabric, especially Kona. Kona would handle pretty well. It's less so the fabric and more so the drafting. So, obviously quilting cotton's not going to hold up as well under tension as Kona would, or a broadcloth, or even a lightweight canvas. Duct cloth, if you can get it thin enough, denim, active wear fabrics. But it really, really comes down to your drafting. So if you're... and it's mostly the crotch. So if you're not drafting your pattern in a way that allows the body to have full range of movement, so that when you, let's just say, go into a fighting stance, it puts too much pressure on the seam, it's going to bust no matter what the fabric is. Because if the fabric's too sturdy, the thread's going to bust. If the fabric's not less sturdy than the thread, the fabric's going to tear. So that one's kind of a 2-for-1 troubleshooting. Is your pattern allowing for full range of movement without stressing any one point? Or and is your fabric designed for heavy use? So again, except for the breathing, I would go I would go with a broadcloth, maybe not Kona, but yeah. So what sort of seams are better for sturdier designs? Guessing a single line of stitching is not the best. No, oh sorry, hang on. Let's I didn't see the other half of that question. In my experience, is it better to make the pants have a low crotch like harem pants? I mean, harem pants are a great way to have that freedom of movement, to not get caught up in the seams. It's really just about knowing how to fit a garment. And if the fabric has a little bit of stretch. So if your fabric has a little bit of lycra in it, it's going to give, which is women's pants, for instance. You can have tight women's pants that still stretch under pressure, or tension, I should say. So, I mean, it really depends. You can have a very well-fitted garment that is made of a semi-stretchy, not an actual stretch fabric, because we're talking about material, not weave. So like Kona, there is no stretch except for on the bias, but most fabrics have stretch on the bias. But going to, first off, did that answer your question, Effany? I will come back to that if not. Aurora, your question of types of seam. So a single line of stitch can be incredibly strong, especially if you know your stitches per inch. So stitches per inch are, as the name suggests, how many stitches are in an inch. Good, thank you. So if you put too many stitches per inch, you're likely to perforate your fabric. If you don't put enough, you're going to end up putting too much pressure or tension on those the threads. There's just not going to be enough stitches to support the tension as fabric moves and stuff. So there are things called gussets, and those are, like you're saying, the orange peel insert. That is called a gusset, or sometimes they're called yokes, depending on where they're put. And that is, yes, to give extra strength, just give a little bit of breathing room in that area, not literally, but like gives a little bit of slack in order to not be so tight under movement. But the seam itself, you can actually take reference from pants like denim. There is a seam called a flat felled seam that is basically, this is one fabric, this is the other fabric. They're sewn like that, and there's 2 rows of stitching that goes over them. That is the entire inseam of jeans, and most pants will have a flat felled, and that is a very sturdy seam. Yeah, so just experiment. Work your way through what seams seem to work with your fabric. So it'll change depending on what fabric you use, because some fabric won't need a bulky seam. Some will, just because you want to have a little bit of extra. And if you don't want to do a flat felled seam, I just do a top stitch and sew down my seam allowance. That's generally what I do in most areas. But I mean, I've just been doing the standard, like, normal. I don't know, I don't want to flash anybody. I'm trying to find my seam. I just do my normal seams. I mean, this one's serged, but it's just a one line. It's just one row of stitching, and then the edges are treated. But and I would argue that's can be a high movement area. All right, for a Kona cotton, what would you recommend recommend for stitches per inch? Give me a second and I will count. I tend to have not a wide, but I tend to set and forget. But looking at an inch on my tunic here, I used 5. And, you know, you might go 6, but I wouldn't go much lower than 5. In fact, I wouldn't go lower than 5 stitches per inch on... I mean, Kona, that will definitely hold Kona just fine. You could go a little higher on Kona. But if a good thing to practice is testing the limits of your fabric. If you have a fabric that you regularly work with, for me that's Kona, but you're not sure, because for me it's hard to express because I've been doing this for almost 20 years, so I don't even think about stitches per inch anymore. I set it and I forget it and I go. But a very good practice for someone just getting into things is to make a binder. I'm going to switch over again. Make a binder where you take a sheet of paper and, you know, you take a 1 inch by 11.5 pieces of fabric, maybe even just like 1.5 inches. So 1.5 inch wide, and 11.5 long of fabric that you use, and you set your dial on your sewing machine to 0. And what you'll do is from 0, you go back to your paper and you divide it with a pencil or pen, mark it off to how many settings you have on your stitches per inch dial. And then you start at the very first one, you sew down, you change it, sew some more, change it, sew some more, change it, sew some more, and so on. And if you want to give a little more room for tension and everything to catch up, you can do multiples of these. Say the first one is settings 1 through 5, the other one's the rest of the settings. And then you put these pieces of fabric, you staple them or double-sided tape to a piece of fabric, or sorry, excuse me, a piece of paper. You write what the fabric is, so fabric type, what you're looking at, stitches per inch, and what you're experimenting. Perfect settings. And then when you go through this and you find the one that you like, you circle it. And you may need to do 2 versions so you can go through and like tug on them and see what's going to pull through, what holds well, what is too many stitches and tears the fabric. But once you've conducted this experiment, you put it on the paper, you make this information known, and you put it in a page protector and in a binder so that you can use that binder as a quick reference to settings to put your machine at, okay? And that is a wonderful tool. And you'll also want to do that for each fabric you use. The fabric for each fabric types you like to use, quilting cotton is a very standard thing, so you may just do it like symphony versus country classic versus, you know, stuff like that. But you also want to do it to if you own a serger. You want to repeat that whole process, divide up the strip of fabric, put all your settings to 0, tweak them each time until you find that perfect setting for that fabric. You circle that setting, or you make a note that this setting right here, this one's perfect. And you use that as a guide. So if you're not super sure, start setting up a quick reference binder, because that's going to be different. It's going to be different per project, how many layers of fabric you've got going. But my general rule of thumb is, if I'm working with something thick and my stitches are looking kind of tiny, then I just make them wider, because that's also going to relieve pressure on the thread itself. Because if your fabric's too thick and you're doing the perfect, stitches per inch, that thickness is also going to like take up thread space, so it can get a little weird. But to go back to a very simple explanation, generally 5 is fine, maybe a little more, maybe 8, 6 to 8. But Kona's really forgiving, so I tend to go with around, I think, I'm trying to think if I've got anything Kona handy. I'm gonna look at the quilting cotton. No. See, like in this inch, I think I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So yeah, I think it just varies. Can I talk about how to use a serger? Yes, I can. A serger, for those who don't know, is a finishing machine that treats the edge of your fabric. So that is what a serger is. What the serger does is hike up my tunic. I don't think that's actually going to reach. Is a serger wraps, not just wraps, but it cuts the edge of your fabric, your seam allowance, and then wraps it in a series of loops to contain the fibers. Sorry for the focus on that. Contains the fibers so that things don't fray anymore. That's why it's called a finishing machine. But to use the serger, you're basically using it like a regular sewing machine, only instead of joining two or more pieces together, you're just cleaning up the edges. I absolutely love having them. I have a 1970s serger. They are much stronger than more modern sergers. But yeah, so you set it up. You line up the edge of the fabric with the blade, because there is a blade in there. That's how it's able to clean up the fabric. And you go, and it loops everything. They are annoying to thread, especially if you don't have the special tweezers that they're kind of long. They're long and they crook down at the end. But I have done threading a serger with a straw, setting the straw behind the piece that you need to put the thread through, and like inhaling to try and suck the the thread through, because I couldn't get it with my fingers. But yeah. I would definitely recommend doing practice runs. If you get your hands on a serger, it can be very intimidating, because if you go too far, unlike a sewing machine where you can just rip out your stitches, it cuts your project. And something to note, French seams. I'll get to that, Effany, in just a second. Something to note about a serger. Sergers are absolutely wonderful. You do not need them. They're a quality of life and a visual quality thing. So if you're just looking to real quick, down and dirty, finish the edge of your seam allowance so it doesn't fray, a satin stitch, also known as the zigzag stitch, is perfectly fine. You just make it as wide as you can, bring it a little close, go down the very edge of the fabric so it captures the edge itself, and then maybe back it up with another so that you have two overlapping. But that is perfectly fine to do. But sergers are definitely an investment worth having if you're going to be making things with edges that are not enclosed. So by enclosed, I mean the edges of my seam allowance is all closed up in here. There are no exposed edges. Everything's enclosed. Those fibers aren't going to come undone. They're sandwiched in there. They're not rubbing up against things that are going to start pulling them away from the weave. So, what is my experience on French seams? I like French seams. French seams are really easy. They're a nice way to finish a straight edge, a straight seam. You can do a French seam on a curve. However, you have to understand, we'll go over to our table again so we can get a visual representation here. You're gonna need to understand the dynamics of space. So that's not what I'll officially call it, but that's what I'm gonna call it, the dynamics of space. So say you've got a curve. Let's just call it your armpit. You know, you've got that T tunic with the very iconic shape right there. Okay. This curve is only so many inches long. Okay. I'm going to make this bigger so we can see it better. Okay. Your seam starts right here. Okay. This seam is a different measurement than this edge. So when you go to flip your fabric around, this all in here needs to expand to accommodate being turned in a different direction. Okay? So if this is inside out and you go to turn it right side out, this needs to expand. It needs to open up, which is why you clip curves. Okay? You clip your curves or snip or whatever you want to call it. Well, snipping is accurate. So that when this seam becomes the seam allowance, it has the room to expand. Because this right here is this edge right here. So when you try and do a French seam, which is how this little tangent is relevant, when you try to do a French seam looks like this. So here's one edge of stitching and here's the other edge of stitching. You have to be able to turn this because you start right side out with your tunic, right side out, the side that everyone will see. You do your seam, then you flip it inside out to fold over this part, your original seam allowance, and then enclose it with another seam. You are going to have to clip in order to get this to sit right, and it does not always work with a French seam if for tight areas. Now you can sometimes it works out, a lot of the times it does not, because the seam allowance needs to have room to expand. And I can also do a video on that. I can do some examples of French seams. All right, so the other question: how did I get into AmpGuard? One Facebook meltdown later. So, sorry folks for second half of the video. Probably sucking something fierce, but at least we're back. No bunching on crangulation. It's all about that clip, the snipping. Um, all about the snipping, like you see here. So any bunching. So you mean like right in the corners, like mine. Here, I'll move it up so you can see. I'll even move in a little close. This is nice and flat. It's all about the clipping. You got to clip really close. Unfortunately, due to how I have to stream this, I'm not able to have my second video or second screen anymore. So give me 2 seconds. You have to clip really close, in order to get the crangulation, as you say, to not pucker or crinkle and crumple or bunch. Another thing is once I have it turned right side out, I give it a little tug. Gentle. You're not trying to like rip it apart. You're trying to stretch it in the axis in which you have sewn it. So you just give it a little tug, give a little tug across here, and then ironing. But yeah, it's all about the clipping or snipping. So there's a difference between clipping and snipping, and I really need to start saying the right one. So this is a snip, because you just go and you snip, and a clip is when you take off a corner. So let's see, there we go. There's your seam. There's your seam allowance. It's reversed for me, so sorry if I start going the wrong direction. But then you just go and you cut off this corner. That is clipping. Snipping is you're just going in and doing a little snip. Clipping is when you take it off, at least to me. What do you typically sell? Do you have examples? So I typically sell belt favors and belt pockets. However, I have sold tunics. I have done commissions. I am wearing the tunic that I have currently worn, and I showed you, I made all of those belt favors and the pockets that I showed earlier. But I can absolutely grab them again for those just coming in. So I am, well, I'll just outright say it. I'm lazy. I do not like to spend a lot of time and effort on a project, but I do like them to look pretty. So when I make things, I generally make ready-to-use items. I do not like making custom orders. It's a lot of pressure to have it be perfect. I have a lot of, I guess it falls into, well, no, it's just low self-esteem, to be honest. I worry that it won't be good enough, and therefore the person won't want it, and I will have spent their money buying materials, and now I can't afford to give it back to them if they say, oh, I absolutely hate it. And no one ever does. They love the stuff that I make them, or so they tell me. And I've never had to redo an order. So this is one of my belt pockets. I do I'll call it a vanity stripe. It's usually just something fun that I put in the middle, or this is all fun fabric, but this is the accent or vanity that I tend to do, and this is just a general pocket. I'll in the future be making master hoods for sale, but I mostly do belt favors and belt pockets. Because I just got an embroidery machine, I'm able to step into the realm of fun belt favors. But yeah, so those are the examples again. So what I typically sell, if I were to be vending, which I'm not currently, but I do have future plans, I want to have wrap pants, tabards, general-sized T-tunics, award-level belt favors, park heraldry belt favors, kingdom favors, and general things that anybody could really come along and say, ooh, that's cool, and grab it. They don't have to worry about like waiting a couple months to a year or more for something custom. It's just grab and go stuff. Can you tell me more about your embroidery machine? As I can. So I have a brother, and it is less so about the machine and more so about the program. So I have the program PE Design that allows me to design my own stuff. And so I go into the program, I design what I want to make, and I have the machine stitch it. So the machine itself only does what the program tells it to, or what the file going on the machine tells it to do. So there's a thing called density, there's stabilizers in which you sew everything into underneath the fabric. And so stabilizer is what gives stability to the fabric as you're punching a bunch of thread through it. So, yeah, so you've got to ensure that you've got a decent quality fabric that you're doing this to, and if you don't, like I am learning how to do it to the cheap quilting cotton, and that requires me to know what settings and stabilizer to use. Do you or would you ever add extra notions like lace, buttons, rivets, grommets, etc. on a pocket? Absolutely. I just really haven't, because again, like I said, I'm kind of lazy. I think lace, ribbon, grommets, and stuff are all amazing accents to throw onto a piece, whether it's a tunic or a belt favor. Notions are a great way. Notions being lace, ribbon, stuff like that. To move it from, oh, that's a pretty good tunic. That looks great. It's pretty nice. To, oh, that's a really good tunic. It just adds just a little bit of extra to it, and it can be cheap ribbon. Like it can be cheap ribbon that if you've just got it going around the neckline of something and around the sleeves like this is technically not a notion. That's just a peekaboo of black fabric. But say that was a ribbon. That's just a little extra to make it not so simple or basic. So a little more deluxe versus basic, or that's great. Yeah, I will probably move into that, but I just tend to keep things simple, because that's my personal style. Is I like simple things. Lace will likely break down faster than the garment itself, so buttons get caught on things, toggles get caught on things. So for me personally, my way of doing things is minimalizing potential wear. Is that safe for battle wear? The embroidery, yes, because it's so low profile, and the chances of something snagging it, again, you're gonna have to have something abrasive catching it just right that you're gonna, or often enough in the same spot that you create wear. But I would say yes, it's safe for battleware. Oh, the notions. It depends on what it is. Buttons I'd be a little wary about, just because the potential of it hooking something. I mean, buttons are meant to catch a buttonhole. But yeah, you're more likely to have buttons caught by swords, or if you're smacked with one, it's a hard piece that you know, if you get stabbed and it happens to have a button underneath the stab point or tip of a sword, you're gonna feel it. But as far as hazardous, it depends on if it's big, if it's bulky. It may hurt if you end up getting stabbed. But chances are, if it's big and bulky, like an antler, like tine as a toggle, that has a higher chance of being like grazed and hit by sword, but it's still going to be a small chance. And the general rule of thumb, if it's super fancy that you're worried about taking on the field, keep it for court garb. If you are going to add a drawstring or ribbon through some holes on your tunic, would you use grommets, eyelets, or like a buttonhole? I think any one of those will do. Honestly, I think to answer that depends on the look you're after. If you're going for a little more rustic look, I would go with the buttonholes. If you're going for courtly, I'd go with grommets or eyelets. I will say if you're going to use grommets and eyelets on fabric, there is a very common issue that you run into of if you add grommets or eyelets to fabric, any fabric, the metal that covers the fabric that you have cut a hole into is generally not wide enough to accommodate the natural stretch or pull that those eyelets and grommets will get. And what ends up happening is, because there's not enough overlap, the fabric stretches just enough to poke a little fiber out. And then you get 2, and then 3, and then your eyelet is gone. So it is always good to put a little bit of something underneath that will act as like a washer, a thin piece of leather, a something that will prevent the fabric under tension from popping out beyond the eyelet itself, or grommet. So to make yourself a washer of some sort, it won't look good, but you'll keep your eyelet and grommet. And it could look good depending on what you use. And again, no, I wouldn't change my answer based on the medium in which I am stringing the lace or cordage through, but some of them are going to behave better than others depending on the fiber. I wouldn't use a grommet or eyelet through something really thin unless I bulked up behind the grommet or eyelet. But yeah, I would say honestly the best bet is going to be either hand sewing a buttonhole or having your machine do a buttonhole. So if you've ever seen fabric that has the natural eyelets in them, it's just a hole that's been whip stitched or hand stitched, or a fancy hand stitching in that hole, like a serger would do along the edge of fabric to contain it. And then you've also got the hole. So yeah, generally speaking, I would reserve eyelets and grommets for thicker material, and hand sewing or buttonholes for thinner material. But you can do any of them for any fabric. You just have to treat the grommets and eyelets a little differently if you're going to use them on thin fabric. Can you talk about the amp guard sash that people wear to show what class they are? How fancy do those get? Generally, if they're on the battlefield, they're not very fancy at all, because those do tend to get hooked by weapons, especially if they're loose. But I mean, I've made them out of Kona. I've made them out of quilting cotton. I prefer prints, and sadly, they don't make printed Kona, at least that I've found. Oh man, I would love it if someone started a company and made Kona or broadcloth that has fun prints like all the quilting cottons do. But aside from that tangent, where you start getting really fancy with them is when they become paragon sashes, because those are generally a little more eccentric or fancy fabrics just in print, or they're not a flat color or a solid rather, so there are prints, there are solids, and they're you know so paragon sashes, because paragon is a title, tend to be a little more fancier. When I make paragon sashes, I use a print fabric, and I trim them with satin, usually by sandwiching a piece of it in between the layers, so that when I flip it right side out, it looks like it has a ribbon sewn into the edges. But yeah, so they tend to be a little fancier with paragon, because that's a fancy title, and you kind of want to be noticed as a paragon, so they tend to be a little fancier. A lot of people who have really fancy sashes don't take them on the battlefield, because there is a higher chance of that being ruined, caught by a sword or something, and ripped, depending on how they're made and how hard the person was trying to strike you. Does Marshall's Dry Goods online store have printed broadcloth? I don't know. I don't think I've ever actually done a search for printed broadcloth. It is just something that I really wish that I could find at Joann's. I cannot find broadcloth that is listed as broadcloth. It may be there, but unless it says broadcloth or Kona and it has a print on it, I won't recognize it as a printed broadcloth. And no, I am not familiar with Marshall's Dry Goods online. Where's the best place to find different symbols? Define symbols for me. If I were to take commissions, what would make that tunic a harder job? Details. Anything where I have to add details is going to add more time and usually material cost. So anything with, so if I were to do a commission for a tunic, I would start bare bones. To me, bare bones is a simple T tunic. It is one piece of yardage that becomes a tunic. I just draft it from that one piece. There's no fancy trims or edges along the hems of the sleeves or hem. So all I have to do is fold over the edges, tack them down, with edges treated and all that, and call it good. If I have to add colored trim with facings, which are a piece, so this is a facing, this black piece is a facing, it's a neck hole facing. Sometimes they are exposed, sometimes they are not. And so if I have an exposed facing on the neck, sleeve, and hem, that's a detail. That's going to add time and material. If there's lace or ribbon or whatever, that goes into it. That makes it hard. If I have to design an applique, that is a lot of detail. That makes it a lot more complicated and harder. The original question of being, where's the best place to find the different symbols? It's kind of difficult. They're scattered everywhere. Generally, once in a while, people start asking, hey, do you have a symbol for this and this? The Orc, which is our online record keeping, has, if people have uploaded their heraldry, They have it on their personal orc page. The kingdom has its heraldry on the orc. Other kingdoms have their heraldries. So the orc, if you know who you're going for, you can find their orc page and you'll see their heraldry if they have one uploaded. If not, you have to ask. Just because everything's kind of scattered everywhere, but the orc is the great place to start. How much harder are things like lettering and words versus a sun or lion head? A lot harder. So because letterings tend to be a lot smaller, which means if you're, and it depends on the method too. If it's embroidery, not hard. It's about the same. The machine does all the work for you. You just have to make the design. If it's applique, which for those who are not familiar with the term applique is where you take pieces of fabric, cut them out in the shapes that you need, adhere them onto a base layer fabric, and satin stitch or zigzag stitch them down to the base layer. You are going to run into a lot more difficulty. It's not impossible, but difficulty getting them smaller curves, smaller points to look good, to not pucker or pull, like gather in because you've overshot the applique. So lettering is a little more difficult, but the same could be said for a high detail design. So if you like the lion, if it's got a jagged mane versus a curved mane, you're gonna have a little more difficulty. But people with really good skill or people who've been doing it for longer, they'll have an easier time. I am not actually very experienced in applique. I would still call myself a beginner because I've maybe done I've done the 2 Spectre Suns applique tabunics for you and 10 Spectre Suns belt fit. No, it was 12 favors. Then I've done maybe 3 other appliques on top of that. So I haven't done a whole lot of applique in my sewing history. So I don't feel I know everything that there is to know about applique. And even if I was really experienced, I probably wouldn't say I know everything. But I would say the lettering would definitely be harder than the sun, potentially harder than the lion head. Just depends on the angles and thickness of the design you're throwing down, thickness of your sewing. Does patchwork quilting have a place in Amtgard? Yes, absolutely. I think a lot of crafts do, because you can make patchwork quilts look fantasy. You can make a cloak that is patchwork quilting. You can make heraldries that are patchwork quilting, like banners. So this is applique. Sorry, I could have said that this is applique. I'll go ahead and pull it off the wall. But you can make banners and stuff out of patchwork. Absolutely. What makes something, so this is applique. So all of this is sewn on top of this, and this is sewn on top of all of this. So it's just layered. So these are under the wheel, and this is under all that, and then all this is under this. But if you look in here, you can see what I mean. But like angles and curves and how finely detailed, sorry for the camera quality, but depending on your angles and fine detail, it can be really hard to do a lot of things. What would you recommend for people to keep in mind who want to ask someone for a commission but don't want to scare the crafter off with designs or ideas? Honestly, that's the comfort level of the crafter. I would just say, if you're looking for a highly detailed, really, really complicated design, go to a crafter that you have seen do highly detailed and complicated designs, because their comfort level will dictate whether they feel comfortable taking that commission. And it is always a good idea to have a doodle of what is in your head. Because if you try and say, hey, I want a pony and I want it to be purple, your purple pony is guaranteed to look very different than the crafter's mental picture of a purple pony. So if you have a drawing, a general idea, it doesn't have to be perfect, of what you're wanting to have done, then as you're talking about it, the crafter the crafter has your visual representation as best as you're able to give, and will have a much better idea of what you're actually talking about and expecting from them. But yeah, honestly, if you're just looking for something simple, go to someone who does a bunch of simple stuff. If you're not wanting something super complicated, go to somebody who does super complicated stuff. It's all about knowing your crafters. But if they're getting scared away by what you're trying to get, it just means that they don't think that they can actually do it. My favorite color, so I have two. My first favorite color is, oh my god, that's bright. And the other favorite color is 90s. Those are my favorite colors. As evident by my tunic. Where is the best place to meet other Amtgard crafters? In the ANS groups, or ANS Discord channels. But there are Amtgard groups out there for just about everything. But yeah, if you're looking for the Amtgard crafters, I would look at the ANS groups, so Arts and Sciences groups. There are a couple discords. They generally tend to be specific to the holdings, like Dragon's Forge has a discord. Satyrs Hollow has a discord. Best and direct answer to that question is go where the crafters are if you would like to meet crafters. And the crafters are often in their own dedicated group, usually surrounding the craft that they like to do. So I am in the Garber's Guild of Amtgard and Black Spire's Garber Guild. If I were to make Garb for an actual goat, it would have 2 legs, because they are more likely to try and chew off the back end, and also I wouldn't want to try to accommodate the peeing or pooping, so or keeping the garment clean because of those reasons. So I would do 2 legs. I'd do the front legs. Have I done any sewing with the monster class? So yes, specifically the satyr costume. I've not done any other monster garb that I can actively remember. However, I do have plans. Oh, so furs. Yeah, so furs are a little interesting. The first thing I will recommend is pay out the ass for the fabric, because the cheap fabrics are not nice on the skin. They don't have the same stretch recovery or elastic memory. So the cheap ones, once you stretch them, they don't come back. They're very scratchy. They're just not the pile, which is the fur itself. The pile does not feel good. It doesn't look good. So if you're wanting to make a really good furred costume, you'll want to invest in the more expensive furs. A really good one is Mongolian fur. It is a long pile. I think it's a 3-inch pile. It could be a little longer or a little shorter. The skeleton wasn't... but it's like not fabric specific, like fur or velvet for a furred look, or scale, something scaly. But another thing to remember is that because furs are very thick, you're gonna want a machine that can, one, handle thick materials, and two, use a walking foot. A walking foot is a mechanism where as the presser foot goes, or as the needle goes up, so does the presser foot, allowing the feed dogs, which are the spiky thing that moves underneath the presser foot, allowing both layers of fabric to be pulled along in an even manner. It's good for thick material, it's good for bulky material, it's good for materials that are sticky like vinyl. A lot of people in quilting will use them uh, because when you have layers that are very thick, what ends up happening is the feed dogs dig into that lower level and they start pulling the lower fabric more than the top fabric. So the top fabric ends up getting squished and shoved and stretched out by the presser foot. So a walking foot allows the feed dogs and everything to, well, it's more like it moves like this together, feeding both layers evenly. I know some folks also shave down a ½ inch of the fur that like along the edge, being mindful not to make it look like the fur got a haircut, but to have it look like that's naturally short fur, that to make it less bulky and look a little better at the seam. No, so it is a special attachment itself. And however, I will say before I run and get it, there are machines that actually move the presser foot themselves. I want to call it a feed machine. I think that's what they're called. Um, where they have that function built in. You can't turn it off. It always does that. But it does have that function. Some might have it where you could turn it off. I only ever worked with them as an industrial in school, so there was no turning that feature off. But or an even feed machine, I think is what they're called. All right, I'm gonna move up so I can make sure that I can see this. So this is a basic generic one for brother machines. Okay, so it attaches to your presser foot post like a normal presser foot because it has its presser foot built in. It has upper feed dogs that this goes over the bar on a sewing machine. Unfortunately, I don't have one, but when you're looking at a sewing machine, you've got the post and you've got the clamp that usually has a long stem off of it where you tighten down your needle and stuff. This part sits above that so that as the needle goes up, it activates the mechanism. So this goes down, pressure comes off the presser foot, the feed dogs underneath feed evenly. So it's a little complicated, but because the whole thing lifts with the as the needle comes up and everything. So I will also say, so far, I have not liked this. I feel this specific attachment, not the walking foot itself, like walking feet, but this specific walking foot, I don't like it. So my chair gives major pink Power Rangers vibe. Yes, I do like pink. I'm not afraid to admit I like pink. I like being obnoxious. So it was also cheaper than the other colors. So bonus. I was going to meet with someone off of a particular website, and we both agreed that we would like to meet in a public setting, and they had a free moment in a very public setting to meet me on a Saturday. So I was like, okay, I work on Saturday, but I'm done around 1. So they were like, sure, why don't you meet me at this park? I will be here from, 12 to 4. I was like, cool. So I show up, and they happened to be at Amtgard. So Amtgard was happening in the field a little bit of ways from where they were sitting. So I was like, what is this? It looks kind of cool. But I was also the person who was like, you'll never catch me dead doing this. This is for nerds, and nerds are weird, and I don't feel comfortable doing that. Yeah. So I was like, that actually looks kind of cool. And I started asking questions. So the following week, I showed up in a satyr costume. It was paper mache and craft fur, like the cheap stuff, and it lasted for a little while because I didn't fight right away. Yeah, so that's how I got into Amtgard, and I started at a park called the Barony of Skystone from the Kingdom of Desert Winds, and it was in Billings, Montana. Uh, how did I get into sewing? So way back when I was a little tot, my grandmother tried to show me. I wasn't a tot. I was like 13. But my grandmother tried to show me how to sew. And she let me use her sewing machine. And 2 seconds in, not even 2 seconds, it jams. And I'm like, oh no, I don't know how to do this. And every time it kept jamming. So I was convinced that anytime I touched a sewing machine, it broke. So I attempted to do very basic hand stitching, but I wasn't forward thinking enough to actually look up how to learn to do better with hand stitching because I was also incredibly impatient. And again, I've said it before, I'm lazy. So fast forward several years, and I'm in a very bad relationship that I want out of as quickly as possible. And so I start thinking about college. And I'm like, okay, well, what would I go to college for? And I'm still living in Montana at the time. I learn about the Art Institute of Seattle, and they have a fashion design major. It's like, cool, I could learn how to sew and make clothes because I really loved that idea. So a week later, I am in Seattle, enrolled in school. Well, it was 2 weeks, but still. Um, I'm enrolled in this, and I get to learn how to sew. And I find out that way long ago me did not understand how the bobbin worked. Specifically, a term called bird's nest, which is where you go to sew, but you haven't held down the strands, the threads, and they pull back into the machine, they bunch up, and they cause a snag, and it jams usually and breaks one of the threads. So that is how I got into sewing, and that was back in 2007. I started college at Art Institute of Seattle learning fashion design, and I've been sewing pretty much ever since. I think there was maybe a span of a month or two, maybe a couple months where I didn't have access to a sewing machine, but I have taken sewing machines on airplanes and Greyhound buses to ensure that on my summer vacation, winter vacation, whatever, I had access to a sewing machine. What is my mundane job? So my current mundane job is a CNA. I am a certified nursing assistant. It's not really anything to do with sewing. I take care of elderly and infirm and disabled individuals in a um, rehabilitation and assisted living uh, um, aspect. So that's my actual mundane job. I'm also a caregiver. I would like to one day be a Garber vendor at Amtgard events and or Ren fairs. I would like to have like this Vardo that is like my backdrop, and from the front, like sitting outside along the side of the Vardo with a really cool awning that comes up off the top of it, that I just have a bunch of really Ren style garb or ant guard clothing. So for me, the days when funds aren't matter are don't matter is when I am on my land, because I dream of a homestead where most of my funds can be probably or most of my bills can be paid in like less than a month of actual work. And so the rest of the year is just like free time to craft. So um, I could actually probably do that now, but that's self-esteem thing. I don't have faith in my ability to generate enough income yet. Because when you're talking about a business, because hobby and business are two very different beasts, even if you're doing the exact same thing. Because in a hobby, you don't have to worry about quota and overhead. Generally speaking, you don't make money, you lose money in a hobby. You do it because you like doing it. In a business, even if it's what you were doing in your hobby, you have to make up for the material usage, make a profit, be able to have enough product to generate more profit. And so there's a lot of overhead, there's a lot of making ends meet, there's travel fees, there's booth fees, so a lot of income dependent on your ability to sell your items. And that's kind of like why now I don't really do commissions, but I'll make things for people, and I don't really worry about if I make money on it. Like if they can pay me, cool, I let them pay whatever. If they can't, then they can do something like a trade, or I may just do it anyway and not worry about the making any money off of it, because I like the act of doing it more than I like the stress of making money off of it. But one day, one day I will make a business of my hobby, and it will be what I do for a living. I will actively be trying to make money off of it. Yeah, um, it is. Everybody wants to be nice, especially to their friends and family, when you make a thing. But if you are trying to make ends meet, you can't do discounts. You can't do spontaneous discounts. You can do planned discounts, especially if you have got items that aren't moving and you really want them to move. You have to understand that, okay, I have this tunic and I've got it marked at $60, but then it's not moving. But these other tunics are, and they're not as expensive. So I have to admit to myself, do I want it to sell, or do I want to absolutely make that $60? Maybe. So planned discounts are good. Spontaneous discounts and like family discount and friend discount, bad. You lose money because everyone starts becoming your friend, and every friend wants discounts. What do you think is the best beginner sewing amped guard project? Belt favors. Absolutely. So when I do um, sewing Ithras, it is actually, I choose belt favors because they're a small project that in a couple hours, depending on the comfort level of the person, you can get a belt favor done in an hour to an hour and a half to 3 hours, depending on the speed they're going, the comfort. They're asking a lot of questions, but generally speaking, if they're just going, it's a quick project. I teach belt favors because they teach you fundamentals and you still get something fun out of it. So the fundamentals that you learn in making a belt favor and making anything a starter project is learning how to follow your edge to keep your seam allowance consistent, learning speed control with the pedal of if you go too fast you're gonna roll right off your small object, learning how to stop as you're approaching a stopping point, and learning how to plant your needle, pick up your presser foot, and rotate. So these are really good things to know when you're doing projects. They're eventually going to be things that you just pick up naturally and as the more you do them. But it's a great small project, so you're not working with this big amount of fabric, this big that ends up getting in your way. It's small, it's practical for learning because you learn different techniques on it, and you still end up with something at the end. So wrap pants are did you see my coloring book pages? There is one that is a pair of pants or pants looking things where the sides of the pants are open and it's got strings coming off of it. Those are wrap pants. So how those work are, because they're completely open, you've got a front side and a back side that both have strings. What you end up doing is you take the front half and you take the strings and you wrap those strings around your back and tie them. And then you take the back piece, wrap the strings around your front and tie them. And they close up the side naturally by just how it overlaps and being tied. And then you usually tuck the ends into the hem into your boots, or you have extra cordage that you wrap up around your calf. It's a good way to have a bunch of people of varying sizes be able to wear garb pants that aren't modern pants. They accommodate so much. They have a little bit of flow. They're just easy to make compared to normal pants. You don't have to worry about someone's hip, waist measurement or butt measurement and all that. They're just a quick, easy pants to throw together and then throw them on over or as pants at Amtgard. Court garb. So, court garb is at the barest and most basic explanation, garb that is so fancy you don't, or fancy enough that you don't want to wear it on the field. Some people do court garb as just nicer fabric, or a more fitted design, a more fitted structured patterning. Some go all out and do historically accurate, but these, generally speaking, court garb is the fancy garb that people wear during court. So when the monarch or the monarchy of a holding hold court, it's usually when they give new business, old business, they hand out awards, they talk about upcoming events, stuff, like they hold court. Court garb is generally reserved for that time. More typically during KLEs and events, because that's when the really important courts happen. So there's a little more precedent and call for court garb, but it's mostly just for the role play aspect and those who like to get into it. It's not a requirement. Most of y'all are peasants anyway. And it's a way for you to wear the fancier stuff without worrying about having it get damaged. So yeah, those ceremonies at the KLEs, that's court. And so court garb would be garb you wear at court. Yeah. I don't actually wear court garb. And to be fair, I'm not a peasant. I hold a title of nobility. I'm a baronet, and therefore I am a noble. So anyone who doesn't have a title of nobility or a title of peerage is technically a peasant. How are things like cloth armor approved for battle? Somebody checks it. So when you go to KLEs and you go to park, you have a safety officer who is supposed to check and recheck periodically. So it is up to you, first and foremost, to ensure that your garb or your armor and your weapons meet Amtgard standards as given in the rules of play. And then when you go and take it out for the first time, you should always get it checked by your champion and or safety officer, whoever that may be. And when you go to events, usually your weapons are checked. I don't think anyone actually checks the armor to make sure that it passes as actual cloth armor and stuff like that. Are dresses seen on the field at all? Yes. Yes. Technically, everyone's wearing one because a tunic is just a dress with a belt. Dresses usually come out in court because they don't always offer the skirt end of it doesn't always offer a wide enough range of motion to prevent tearing. So you go to run and you can't spread your stance enough. You get hung up on the skirting and it tears. But if you go classical, you just take the middle. So you A pose. You like widespread your feet. You reach down to the middle of the skirt, the dress skirt. You take it up, and you do this like fancy tie with it to get your skirt to basically turn into pantaloons. It depends. So a typical tunic length is just above the knee because that allows the person to take a knee without stepping on or kneeling on their tunic when they go to get back up. More accurately, a tunic is usually 6 inches past, at least when I make them. So I always add 6 inches to the total length of a tunic so that when you're wearing it, you hike it up a little above your belt, and that 6 inches accommodates the ability to do this. So if it's really tight, you go to do this, you can bust out your arm seam. But generally, most tunics are around just above the knee. Like it's all up to the person and the season, really. So a lot of people like, so these are, I think, technically 3/4 because they're past my elbow. Some people like short, some people like long. Just depends. I made one tunic for a child, and it's interesting because the proportions are very different. Mostly it is trying to accommodate very tiny across the shoulders but big heads. Kids tend to have very big heads in proportion to the rest of their body. So your neck hole is likely going to be a keyhole, which is what you see here. It is I'm rocking a keyhole neckline. Actually, I don't think that's accurate. Well, it is accurate. This opening right here, if this were buttoned, this is a keyhole, which is why it tends to be called the keyhole neckline. Yes. Usually. You can also have a smaller neckline, so this would be like a really small neckline. As long as there is a way to accommodate the head as a whole, you can have a tight neckline or high neckline, or a wide neckline, a low neckline. So when you hear high neckline versus low neckline, you're talking about right here. So this would be a high neckline. See, I've made it very wide, but that's because I really don't like things up around here. So if a neckline was high, you'd be like looking up here. And the low neckline, you start getting into that the cleavage showers, the chest showing, the deep, like the Empire neckline was very low. That went below the tatas. Can you show how to measure that? Yes, very easily. Not right here, because I don't have my actual tape measure. But what I do when I measure for a neckline is I hold the tape measure up, and I look right here. Let's see if I can actually. There we go. I measure from here to here visually, and then I measure across the head. I just eyeball it. But So depending on the style of my neckline, I accommodate those, and that I can actually show you. I have a book that I've drawn out the basic necklines. Ugh. So, um, so I just eyeball, and it has been very accurate. Like I get close, like I like visually get close. But as long as you're able to clear everything without being too tight, you can have any shape of neckline you want. The split is a little hard to demonstrate on as a little doodle, but if you know the general Roman costuming, it's just this wide neckline like that. It's very high. It just comes straight, and there's a little bit of downward droop in the front, so you're not choking yourself. But would you be able to show how to sew various necklines in a video? Yes. Yes, I can. They are all basically the same. To be fair, most sewing is in fact quite simple. You follow an edge. That is how you sew. You follow an edge. So I'm going to express something that a lot of people don't talk about. Sewing is the action. Okay? Sewing is getting your machine to physically sew. Construction is how you get pieces of fabric to become a tunic. And drafting is how you make those pieces to then become a tunic. So sewing itself is the art of following an edge and to join one piece of fabric to another, sometimes multiple pieces of fabric. The construction is the process in which you employ to know how which pieces go to what order, and so on. So sewing is simple. Getting the hang of sewing is not so much. But the act of sewing is simple. You push the pedal, the machine goes, you are sewing. Whether you are sewing well, that is a different thing. But the act of sewing, or sewing, is the action. Garment making is far more about drafting and construction than it is actual sewing. Can you show the process of constructing and drafting, or drafting and then constructing for a tunic from start to finish? Yes, I can do that. And now, mind you, getting all of these done will take a little time, but yes, I can do that. It generally not including ironing and cutting out the pieces. It generally takes me anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half to make a basic T-tunic. So yeah, it will probably take longer to film it, but yes, I can do that. I will get to learn how to do the speed this section up, so you're not watching me like live. It's like watching a cooking show where you're doing everything live, like in time, and you don't have anything prepared. It's like, okay, now we're waiting for the water to boil. 8 minutes later. How did you pick your amp guard name? So which one? My very first amp guard name was Blaylock. It was the roleplay character of the satyr I played. Then, because no one ever called me Blaylock, and they only ever called me Satyr, I changed it to Satyr. And then, because I got tired of people calling me by my species, I grabbed Silenus. Silenus is actually the name of a mythological person. I don't know if he actually existed or not, but Silenus was the mentor and tutor to Dionysus. He was also the general in charge of the satyrs during the Battle of the Titans. If anyone's actually seen me fight, they will hopefully recognize that what I lack in fighting skill, I actually excel or make up for in strategy. I was a very keen strategist in my early fighting days, and I still employ it now. The people of Satyr's Hollow, can attest to that fact. In fact, Balanos can attest to that fact. So I finish them with basic top stitching. I finish with the top stitch. So when I turn it right side out, if it's an edge, I top stitch. If it's not an edge, I just leave it alone. I do my seam. I finish my seam edge, my seam allowance with the serger, and like on my hems. Are we gonna focus? No. Okay. You can see this. So this stitching is called a top stitch. You do not have to top stitch. I top stitch in place of ironing because I hate ironing. I never have to worry about my edges looking puffy. Well, this one I might, but like every once in a while you'll see puffy edges. It's because they're not top stitched or anything. They need to be ironed again. But generally, like this is just left to itself. There's top stitching up here because what I did was I took this fabric. This fabric was about this long. I folded it in half and I top stitched it down, and that creates the top stitch line that you see here. Like how do I finish the hems and stuff? I usually just have a trim where I just fold it over and I do that. Oh, how do I keep the top stitch from wrinkling my fabric? That happens for a very specific reason. So when you're talking about when you wash things, right? I'll wait to see if that's what you're meaning. Like when you go and you wash a garment and then it comes back and it's wrinkled. Yes. Okay. So that happens for a very specific reason. So when you buy fabric, generally we wash it. Okay? We wash our fabric. That does two things. That pre-shrinks, so running it through the washer and then running it through the dryer, that pre-shrinks your fabric. It also gets out it's called stay. It's a treatment. It's a fabric treatment, especially on colored and print things. You won't have stays in something like muslin. So you pre-treat your fabric. Sometimes fabric comes pre-washed from the store, so it'll say like pre-washed and stuff like that. Thread, however, is not pre-treated against shrinkage. So when you go and you wash your fabric, it stays the same because it has already been pre-shrunk. But your thread hasn't. So your thread shrinks. And that's what causes the wrinkling. Your thread itself has shrunk. There are two ways to prevent this. Wash cold, hang dry, or this is the option that no one in their right mind should do because it is a pain in the ass. You take your spool of thread, usually a cotton thread or a blended thread, you take your thread, you unwind it onto a piece of wood that is loosely wrapped in fabric. You take your thread, you wrap it around this, not super tight, you wrap it around this for however long it takes you to wrap it. You stick it in something so it doesn't come undone. And you throw it through the wash and the dryer. And that shrinks your thread, in which you then take it off of that spool, that makeshift spool, and you rewind it onto a spool. and you now have pre-shrunk thread. Generally speaking, which is why I tell people wash cold, hang dry. It is the process of heating and then quickly cooling your thread or fabric that creates the shrink. And that's you will still sometimes get it even if you do that, just because of the nature of something swelling and then shrinking back into size through the water. If the water gets too warm, it expands because heat expands, cold contracts. So it is the process of quickly cooling that shrinks fabric and thread. And they generally stay shrunk because the fibers have interlocked at that size. That's why when you go to unshrink wool, you get it cold and you pull it apart and then you let it dry naturally. You let it slowly dry so that the fibers don't get agitated and shrink and interlock. But yeah, so those are 2 ways that I personally know of to prevent the shrinkage of washing. That's you can get away with the hang drying usually because washing machines spin them really well. If your washing machine doesn't spin it really well, you can throw it in the dryer on delicate. You'll still might get a little bit of shrinkage. It won't be as bad as throwing it in high heat. But yeah, that's just the nature of thermodynamics, I guess. I think that's the one that controls that. It sucks. The other option, the third option, is in fact dry cleaning, because you're not actually washing, you're chemically treating your fabric to clean it. Or just embrace the pucker. Or wash cold, hang dry. Or delicate dry. But yeah, that's the sucky part. I would go as far as to say there is no true way to 100% avoid some puckering because the thread is not pre-shrunk. But that is a thing. That's just embrace the pucker. Yeah, it sucks. I have had very gorgeous pieces that that has had that to it. Now, I will say that can also play to your advantage. Oh shoot, I've got too much fabric that I need to ease into. So easing is the process of using the feed dogs to draw in more fabric because you have excess that you need to sneak in somewhere. So easing in the fabric is you put the excess side down so that the feed dogs, you give resistance to the top layer so it doesn't move as much, and the feed dogs draw in more over the course of sewing that you draw it on in. And then you can use heat like the iron. You can get it wet, spray it down, and you steam iron it, and it will shrink in and make it look a little bit more uniform. So you can kind of that pucker can sometimes play to your advantage. I have done that. So puckering is also actually a term, a specific term. And the best way, puckering is when you have some of that excess, and what it does is it folds as you are stitching. And it's usually very tiny. So that top, that's your stitching, and the zigzag one underneath it, that's the little crease that then gets sewn. That is the technical term. That is called a pucker. So I don't know what the technical term for the bunching is called. Like when you don't have enough in the crenulation, when you don't clip in enough and you're forcing, like I said, fabric needs room to expand. If you are taking a small thing and opening it up. It needs, if you don't, it pulls. No, pleats are intentional. So pleats are intentional. So how do you do a pleat? A pleat is an intentional fold. They are math. So the way you do a pleat is you math. If you want a 1-inch pleat, you draft in 2 inches of fabric. So that when you fold it, you pinch it together and then lay it down, you have a pleat. It's just math. And depending on how you want the pleat to sit, that's just in the drafting. I hate pleats. I absolutely hate them. I hate how they look. I definitely hate one-directional pleating. That's where most people, like when you think of like a school uniform skirt, where that pleat goes one direction all the way around, that drives me nuts. So other common garb pieces are cloaks, hoods, Russ pants. So R-U-S-S, Russ pants. Those are common, which are pleated. Those at least don't look as bad as pleat front slacks, okay? But they still, they are not a uniformed pleat. And for me, it's an OCD thing. I don't like pleats, generally because they don't stay flat. A pleat looks best when it lays flat. And generally speaking, pleats on a body do not lay flat. So common, we sometimes get poet shirts. We get vests to go over the poet shirts, Russ pants, hoods, either in the chaperon or the Viking hood. I forget the actual term, the actual name of the Viking hood. I would if I had different amped guard clothing. I wear the basic T-tunics. However, I will try and find some good pictures because, in fact, actually, for an ANS, it might be a fun ANS thing to do to have a fashion show. That could totally be a color thing too. Effany takes wonderful pictures. In fact, she can probably get you a lovely set of pictures or tag you in photos of the various types of clothing. So when winter comes around, you're going to start seeing the cloaks, ponchos, and hoods. We generally, outside of winter, we generally give out hoods for master hoods because puns are fun. But yeah, but that's the Viking one. A chaperon is the medieval hood that was also used as a hat. They would roll up the neck part and the hood part. They would roll it up and they would use it like they would have a hat with a very long tail. That's a chaperon. Spelled like chaperone, like the person that goes to the dance that you really wish didn't. Yeah, I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce that. I'm not even going to attempt that. Do we have any hooked on phonics for that? I need the phonetic of that one. Yep, very true. That's why we refer to it as the Viking hood. It's probably pronounced Skoldham, or something close to that, Skjold. Ham or Skjoldaham, Skoldaham, but yeah, I'm probably butchering that. I think we are good to go ahead and end this stream. Thank you everyone who came and participated. I had a fun time answering questions as best I could. There will be upcoming videos on YouTube probably over the course of the next few months, because just let's be honest, it's going to take some time for me to do videos and get them edited and get them up. But the Right now, the current list of videos to do are using a sewing machine, or sorry, using a serger, a demonstration of the operation of a walking foot, an embroidery demonstration for the Dusk Hollow heraldry, uh, a video tutorial on making wrap pants, a video tutorial of sewing the various necklines. I am likely going to actually be drafting and sewing those necklines, and a video tutorial on the start to finish of a T-tunic from drafting the pattern to finished sewing ready to wear. Those are what I have written down. There may be more that I missed or forgot. However, at this time, that's what I got. So thank you for joining me. I look forward to many more questions that are likely to arise after this video. If you have any questions, feel free to post them to this page, direct message me, or find me in person to go ahead and ask your questions. I am not opposed to answering any question that I am actually capable of answering. And if I can't, I'll send you a YouTube, or I will make a YouTube for you to follow along and get your answers. Thank you so much, and have a great night.